Imagine waking up at 2:13 in the morning because you hear something scratching inside your wall. Not loud. Just faint enough that you almost ignore it. You lie there for a second listening. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Probably a mouse, you tell yourself. Nothing unusual. You live near woods. Or an old shed. Or maybe the weather changed and something got inside looking for warmth. The next morning, you sweep a few tiny black droppings out from under the sink without thinking twice about it. Maybe you even vacuum the corner where you found them. Then you leave for work. Normal day. Completely ordinary. But what you cannot see, cannot smell, and cannot feel happening in that moment is that the air around you may already contain microscopic viral particles powerful enough to shut down your lungs from the inside out. Not days from now. Not years from now. Possibly within a week. And the most terrifying part is this. For the first several days, hantavirus feels almost identical to the flu. Mild fever. Muscle aches. Fatigue. Maybe chills. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic. Most people continue going to work. Driving. Shopping. Sleeping beside their families while the virus quietly spreads through the smallest air sacs inside the lungs, triggering an immune reaction so violent that by the time doctors recognize what is happening, many patients are already fighting for oxygen in an intensive care unit. This is not a movie scenario. This is real. And over the past few years, infectious disease specialists have become increasingly alarmed by how easily ordinary exposure to contaminated dust, garages, barns, storage units, cabins, and even closed rooms can turn into a life-threatening medical emergency without warning. Tonight, I'm going to show you exactly how hantavirus spreads through the air, why so many people miss the early symptoms, and the hidden mistakes that dramatically increase your risk without you ever realizing it. Here is what makes hantavirus different from almost every other illness people casually ignore in the beginning. The death rate. Not the infection rate. The death rate. Because while most viruses that spread through the air cause symptoms people recover from at home, hantavirus has one of the highest fatality rates of any respiratory infection doctors routinely monitor. In some outbreaks, nearly 4 out of every 10 infected patients do not survive. Think about that carefully. Not 4%. 40%. And what terrifies infectious disease experts is not just how deadly it can become once it reaches the lungs. It is how incredibly easy the original exposure often seems. Cleaning an old attic. Opening a long-closed cabin. Sweeping out a garage. Moving boxes in a dusty storage room. Starting an old vehicle that sat unused for months. Completely ordinary situations. In many documented cases, patients never touched a rodent directly. They never got bitten. Never handled anything obviously dangerous. All it took was inhaling microscopic particles contaminated with infected rodent urine, saliva, or droppings after those particles became airborne. That is why health investigators repeatedly use one specific phrase when discussing hantavirus transmission. Aerosolized exposure. Meaning the virus can ride invisible dust floating through the air around you. Now here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous. Most people have absolutely no idea when exposure actually happens. You do not feel the virus enter your body. There is no immediate cough. No burning sensation. No dramatic warning sign. For days, sometimes even weeks, nothing appears wrong at all. Then the first symptoms begin so mildly that many people dismiss them completely. Fever. Fatigue. Headache. Muscle pain, especially in the legs and lower back. Symptoms so ordinary they are mistaken for exhaustion, flu, dehydration, even stress. Meanwhile, inside the body, the virus may already be attacking the lining of tiny blood vessels in the lungs, causing fluid to leak where oxygen is supposed to move freely. And once that stage begins, the progression can become terrifyingly fast. Patients who seem stable in the morning can be struggling to breathe by nighttime. Some require mechanical ventilation within hours. Doctors describe certain cases as patients essentially drowning from fluid buildup inside their own lungs while oxygen levels collapse despite emergency treatment. And the reason preparedness matters so much is because there is currently no universally approved cure that simply kills hantavirus once severe lung involvement begins. Supportive care becomes the battle. Oxygen. Ventilators. Critical care intervention. Trying to keep the patient alive long enough for the immune system to regain control. That is why early recognition and prevention matter so much more than people realize. Because with hantavirus, the most dangerous mistake is assuming the environment around you is automatically safe simply because it looks clean, quiet, or familiar. So here is exactly what we are going to do together in this video. I am going to walk you through the 7 most dangerous hantavirus exposure mistakes people make without realizing they are putting themselves directly in the path of airborne infection. And the reason this matters is because several of these mistakes are things millions of people do completely automatically. Sweeping floors. Opening windows. Using a vacuum. Cleaning sheds. Even entering certain rooms the wrong way. One of the exposure mistakes on this list is so common that infectious disease investigators repeatedly find it at the center of entire family exposure events. Not because people were careless. Because nobody ever taught them the correct procedure in the first place. We are also going to break down the exact early warning signs that separate ordinary flu symptoms from the first stage of hantavirus infection because timing matters enormously with this virus. Recognizing the danger even 12 to 24 hours earlier can completely change how quickly someone receives emergency medical support. Then I am going to show you the specific environments where exposure risk becomes dramatically higher, including one location most people never think about even though it creates nearly perfect conditions for airborne viral particles to accumulate for weeks or even months undisturbed. And near the end of this video, I am going to explain the single most important survival principle infectious disease teams use before entering potentially contaminated areas themselves. Because here is the reality. The biggest danger with hantavirus is not panic. It is false normalcy. The assumption that because a room looks clean, because the droppings look old, because there is no visible rodent running around, because you have clean spaces like this your entire life, that there is no real threat present. That assumption is exactly what catches people off guard. And I need you to pay especially close attention to exposure mistake number 2 because it directly involves something people instinctively do within the first few seconds of discovering rodent droppings. Unfortunately, it is also one of the fastest ways to push contaminated particles directly into the air around your face. Most people believe they are cleaning safely when they do it. They are actually multiplying the exposure risk. By the end of this video, you are going to understand how hantavirus actually spreads, how to reduce your risk dramatically, and what emergency warning signs should never be ignored once symptoms begin. Because when it comes to airborne viruses like this, the safest people are usually not the strongest. They are the most prepared. Number 7. Entering closed spaces too quickly. You unlock an old cabin, a garage, a basement, a storage shed that has been sealed for weeks or months. And the first instinct almost everyone has is to walk directly inside. That is the mistake. Because enclosed spaces contaminated by rodents can trap airborne viral particles in still air for long periods of time. The moment the door opens, air pressure changes. Dust shifts. Tiny contaminated particles become suspended around breathing level. Infectious disease experts recommend ventilating closed spaces for at least 30 minutes before prolonged entry whenever rodent contamination is suspected. Not after cleaning. Before entering. Number 6. Assuming old droppings are harmless. This one catches people constantly. They see dried droppings and assume the danger is gone because everything looks old. But dried contamination can actually become easier to aerosolize, meaning easier to break apart into microscopic airborne particles. And once disturbed, those particles do not announce themselves. No smell. No color. No visible cloud warning you to step back. Which is why old contamination should never be treated casually just because it looks inactive. Number 5. Cleaning without protective barriers. One of the biggest misconceptions about hantavirus is believing ordinary household cleaning automatically equals safe cleaning. It does not. If you are handling contaminated nesting material, insulation, cardboard, or rodent waste without gloves and respiratory protection, your exposure risk rises dramatically. Because the virus is not spreading through dirt itself. It spreads through what becomes airborne while you disturb that dirt. And many people only realize how much dust they created after they have already inhaled it. Number 4. Vacuuming rodent droppings. This is one of the worst mistakes on the entire list. Never vacuum rodent droppings. Never. Because vacuum motors and airflow systems can blast contaminated particles directly back into the air in an ultrafine mist small enough to travel throughout the room. The exact thing people use to clean may actually become the mechanism spreading contamination farther. This is why health agencies repeatedly warn against vacuuming or dry sweeping potentially infected areas. Number 3. Dry sweeping before disinfecting. This mistake happens almost automatically. Someone sees droppings. They grab a broom. And within seconds, invisible contaminated dust is moving through the air around their face. Proper cleanup protocols start with saturation, not sweeping. Disinfectant solution. Moistening contaminated areas thoroughly. Allowing time for particles to settle and become less airborne before removal begins. Because dry movement creates airborne spread. Moisture suppresses it. Number 2. Ignoring flu symptoms after exposure. This is where situations become deadly. A person cleans an attic on Saturday. By Wednesday they feel exhausted. Maybe feverish. Body aches. Headache. They assume they caught a seasonal virus and stay home to rest. But hantavirus often begins exactly this way before respiratory symptoms suddenly accelerate. And once shortness of breath starts, the condition can deteriorate with shocking speed. That is why recent rodent exposure combined with flu-like illness should never be dismissed casually, especially after cleaning contaminated indoor spaces. Number 1. The look safe trap. This is the most dangerous hantavirus mistake of all because it overrides every survival instinct people normally trust. The space looks clean. No smell. No live rodents running across the floor. No obvious danger. So the brain relaxes. And that false sense of safety is exactly where some of the highest risk exposures begin. A person opens an old camper before summer. Someone cleans out a deceased relative's garage. A family enters a vacation cabin that sat closed all winter. Everything appears normal except for maybe a little dust in the corners. A few forgotten boxes. Old blankets. Some debris under shelves. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger fear. So they begin cleaning normally. Windows closed. No mask. Dry sweeping. Vacuuming. Moving objects that may have been contaminated for months. And what they do not realize is that rodent urine and droppings can dry into fine infectious material so light it becomes airborne with the smallest disturbance. Pulling a tarp. Lifting a box. Shaking a blanket. Even footsteps across contaminated dust can push particles back into the air around breathing level. That is why infectious disease investigators repeatedly describe hantavirus exposure using one terrifying phrase. Activities associated with disturbance. Not bites. Not attacks. Disturbance. Meaning ordinary movement itself becomes the danger. And here is what makes this virus psychologically deceptive. Human beings are wired to fear obvious threats. Smoke. Blood. Violence. Visible contamination. But hantavirus hides inside normality. Inside silence. Inside spaces people have entered hundreds of times before without consequence. Which is why so many exposures begin with complete confidence that nothing dangerous is present. Then days later the symptoms begin. Fever. Muscle pain. Exhaustion. The person assumes they have the flu. But inside the lungs, fluid leakage may already be starting. And when breathing difficulty finally appears, patients often describe something horrifyingly specific. The sensation that they cannot pull enough air into their body no matter how hard they try. Doctors treating severe hantavirus cases have compared the progression to lungs slowly filling while oxygen disappears faster than the patient can compensate. Some deteriorate within hours. Completely healthy people. No warning history. No chronic illness. Just exposure they never recognized as dangerous. That is why the most important survival skill with hantavirus is not strength. Not speed. Not even medical knowledge. It is respecting invisible risk before symptoms ever begin. Because the safest assumption you can make around rodent contamination is this. If particles can become airborne, your lungs are already part of the environment. Before you leave this video, I want you to lock 7 things into memory because in an actual exposure situation, people rarely have time to stop and research what they should have done differently. So remember this. Number 1. Never rush into a closed space that may contain rodent contamination. Open it. Ventilate it. Wait. Fresh airflow is not optional. It is your first protective barrier. Number 2. Never assume old droppings are harmless. Dry contamination is often more dangerous because it breaks apart more easily and becomes airborne faster. If it can turn into dust, it can reach your lungs. Number 3. Never clean rodent contamination without protection. Gloves matter. Respiratory protection matters. Because hantavirus does not need a cut or a bite to infect you. Breathing is enough. Number 4. Never vacuum or dry sweep droppings. This is one of the fastest ways to launch contaminated particles directly into the air around your face. Moisture first. Disinfect first. Containment first. Movement comes last. Number 5. Pay attention to the timing of symptoms after possible exposure. Flu-like illness after cleaning contaminated spaces should never be treated casually. Especially if breathing difficulty begins appearing afterward. The earlier doctors know hantavirus is possible, the faster emergency care can escalate. Number 6. The most dangerous environments are often the quietest ones. Cabins. Sheds. Garages. Storage units. Campers. Places closed for long periods where rodent activity can accumulate undisturbed without anyone noticing. And finally, number 7. Do not trust appearances. This virus hides inside ordinary situations. That is why preparedness matters so much. Because people are usually not exposed during dramatic survival scenarios. They are exposed during completely normal daily tasks they have performed their entire lives. Cleaning. Organizing. Opening old spaces. Moving stored items. The ordinary is what makes hantavirus dangerous. And if there is one thing I hope stays with you after this video, it is this. Invisible risk still causes real damage. You do not need to see danger for danger to exist. That single understanding changes the way people protect themselves forever. If this video gave you information you genuinely did not know before today, send it to someone who cleans garages, cabins, barns, storage rooms, campers, or old buildings regularly, because most exposures happen to people who never believed they were doing anything risky in the first place. Stay alert. Stay prepared. And never underestimate what can travel through the air you cannot see. There is one final thing people misunderstand about hantavirus that deserves serious attention. Prevention does not begin when you discover rodent droppings. It begins long before exposure ever happens. Because once contaminated particles are already in the air, your options become far more limited. The safest strategy is reducing the chance that rodents enter and settle inside human spaces in the first place. And this is where small overlooked habits matter far more than most people realize. Tiny wall openings. Gaps beneath doors. Unsealed food containers. Cluttered storage areas. Piles of fabric, paper, cardboard, or insulation left untouched for long periods. These environments create ideal nesting conditions. Warmth. Shelter. Darkness. Minimal disturbance. Exactly what rodents search for. What makes this dangerous is how quietly infestations can grow before anyone notices. A few droppings in the corner may look insignificant, but rodents often contaminate far more area than people realize while moving through walls, attics, crawlspaces, and ventilation paths at night. And because hantavirus exposure is linked so heavily to airborne particles, every additional nesting area increases the amount of contaminated material capable of becoming airborne later. That is why environmental control matters so much. Reducing clutter. Sealing entry points. Storing food properly. Inspecting unused buildings regularly instead of leaving them closed for entire seasons. Even improving airflow and sunlight exposure in storage areas can help make environments less attractive to rodent activity over time. Preparedness is rarely one dramatic action. Usually, it is a series of quiet preventative decisions repeated consistently before danger ever appears. And there is another reason this matters psychologically. People tend to think survival depends entirely on reacting correctly during emergencies. But with infectious diseases like hantavirus, survival often depends on preventing the emergency from developing at all. The person who avoids exposure entirely never faces the terrifying countdown that begins once symptoms appear. That is the real goal. Not fear. Not panic. Reduction of unnecessary risk. Because the truth is, most people watching this video will probably never encounter hantavirus directly. But the people who do are often convinced beforehand that it could never happen to them. That is the pattern investigators see over and over again. Ordinary environment. Ordinary task. Ordinary confidence. Then suddenly, a medical emergency nobody expected. Preparedness interrupts that pattern. Awareness interrupts that pattern. And sometimes, a single change in routine is enough to prevent an exposure that otherwise would have happened without warning. That is why information like this matters. Before you leave, I want you to think about one person in your life who would probably never consider themselves at risk for something like this. Maybe your father who spends weekends cleaning out the garage. Your mother organizing old storage boxes in the attic. A grandparent opening a vacation cabin after winter. A friend renovating an old shed. Someone who works around barns, campers, warehouses, basements, or long-closed buildings and has absolutely no idea that a simple cleaning routine could expose them to an airborne virus this dangerous. Because that is the part people miss. Hantavirus does not usually target people doing reckless things. It targets ordinary people doing ordinary tasks. And in many cases, the exposure happens before the person even realizes the environment was contaminated. That is why awareness matters so much. Not to create fear. To create recognition. Recognition of warning signs. Recognition of dangerous cleanup mistakes. Recognition that invisible airborne particles can still create very real medical emergencies. And if this video changed the way you think about rodent contamination even slightly, send it to someone else right now while you are still thinking about it. One share. One conversation. One person deciding not to vacuum droppings. One family choosing to ventilate a closed cabin before entering. One individual recognizing flu-like symptoms after exposure early enough to seek medical attention faster. Sometimes prevention looks incredibly small in the moment. until you realize what it prevented later. And if you learned something valuable today, comment the word prepared below, because I want to know how many people are walking away from this video more aware than they were 20 minutes ago. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns on hidden health risks, emergency preparedness, airborne threats, survival psychology, and the invisible dangers most people never see coming until it is too late. Stay alert. Stay informed. And remember, the most dangerous threats are often the ones that feel the most ordinary right before everything changes. And after researching hantavirus, one thing became impossible for me to ignore. Some of the deadliest threats people face are not the dramatic dangers everyone talks about. They are the quiet ones hidden inside normal routines. The ordinary habits nobody questions until something goes wrong. And that is exactly why in the next videos, we are going to break down several other invisible emergency risks most people are completely unprepared for. Including the household cleaning mistake that can accidentally create toxic airborne gas inside your home within seconds. The reason infectious disease specialists are increasingly warning people about certain abandoned buildings and water-damaged structures after storms. The hidden survival danger inside tightly sealed modern homes during prolonged power outages. And one emergency room pattern doctors repeatedly see after heat waves that most families never recognize until a loved one suddenly becomes confused, disoriented, or collapses without warning. We are also going to cover the psychological side of emergency preparedness, because panic itself becomes dangerous during fast-moving health situations. Why some people freeze. Why others underestimate risk completely. And how small preparation habits dramatically increase survival outcomes long before professionals ever arrive. Because preparedness is not paranoia. Preparedness is understanding how quickly ordinary situations can change once hidden risk enters the picture. And the more you understand these patterns now, calmly, before emergencies happen, the less likely you are to make dangerous decisions under stress later. That is why this channel exists. To help people recognize threats early. To replace panic with awareness. And to give ordinary individuals practical information most people never learn until after a crisis already begins. So if you want more deep breakdowns on hidden health dangers, emergency survival psychology, airborne risks, environmental threats, and the small mistakes that quietly turn ordinary situations into medical emergencies, make sure you are subscribed before you leave. Because the next topic we are covering may involve a danger already sitting somewhere inside millions of homes right now. Completely unnoticed. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Most life-threatening emergencies do not begin with alarms. They begin with ordinary moments people underestimate. A strange smell dismissed for too long. A mild symptom ignored. A cleaning mistake that seemed harmless. A room that looked safe. And by the time many people realize the danger was real, they are already reacting instead of preparing. That is the pattern we are trying to break on this channel. Because information changes outcomes. Awareness changes decisions. And sometimes a single piece of knowledge learned 5 minutes earlier becomes the difference between a close call and a catastrophe. So if you value calm, practical breakdowns of hidden health risks, airborne threats, emergency survival strategies, preparedness psychology, and the invisible dangers most people never recognize until it is too late, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Not because fear is useful. Because preparation is. This channel is built for people who want to understand what others overlook before ordinary situations become emergencies. And if you stay with us, you are going to learn how to recognize warning signs earlier, respond more intelligently under pressure, and avoid dangerous mistakes that millions of people make every year without realizing the consequences until afterward. Because the reality is simple. Emergencies do not care whether someone feels prepared. Viruses do not care whether someone believes exposure is unlikely. Hidden risks do not disappear because nobody talks about them. The safest people are usually the ones who paid attention before everyone else did. So subscribe if you want to stay one step ahead of the dangers most people never see coming. And until the next video, stay aware, stay prepared, and never underestimate how fast an ordinary day can become a survival situation.